The reading is taken from Ruth chapter 1, verses 19 through 22. So Naomi and Ruth went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, "Is this Naomi?" She said to them, "Call me no longer Naomi. Call me Mara. For the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi, when the Lord has dealt harshly with me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?" Naomi returned together with Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law who came back with her from the country of Moab. They came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. Well, I hope the homily goes better than the reading did. In the Book of Ruth, it comes in the Christian Bible at the end of Judges. And Judges ends with this statement that there was no king in Israel, and everyone did as they saw right in their own eyes. And we know how that goes when we are totally self-absorbed and self-centered. Judges is filled with stories of violence and cruelty, comparable to what we see in our own century and in recent decades in the past. It was every person for themselves. And women in particular were very vulnerable. The covenant that God had made with Israel at this time was in much disarray. We might remember that at the heart of God's covenant was the very nature of God Himself, a God of loving kindness, one who sought to show compassion, to be merciful, to seek justice for all. And this was definitely disarray in the time of Judges, in the time of Ruth. God had a particular interest in the poor, in the alien, in those that we would call sojourners. And this comes out in this text. But loving kindness was not the dominant quality in the tribes of Israel in that day. The story is filled with irony. Naomi, with her husband Elimelech, had left Bethlehem, meaning the house of bread, in a time of famine, in this time of violence in Israel. They had gone to a foreign country, Moab, that had a little bit of a colored history with Israel. If it was not hostility, there was at least tenseness between the two countries. And yet this family sought relief from famine in the place of an enemy, where they were very vulnerable. And while their things seemed to go well early on, but then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, dies, and their two sons die, who had married Moabite women, and now the three women are left vulnerable and in a very difficult time. Naomi makes the decision to return to Bethlehem because she had heard there's bread in the house of bread again, that God had favored them. But as we read in the text this morning, the section that I read, Naomi feels like that God has stricken her and her family. The author doesn't say whether her perception is right or wrong. It does not judge her in that, but we know the feeling. Last Friday, I heard on the world news that refugees from Syria had taken the risky trip across the Aegean, and their rickety wooden boats had sunk, and there were probably 100 who had drowned, many of them being children. Syrian parents wanting something better for their children and willing to become refugees, migrants, in a foreign land, among a foreign people, just wanting what is better for their children. I think back to 9/11, and we saw all those stories. And the one young lady going from hospital to hospital seeking her fiancé because he had not called from the World Trade Center that day. She was still holding out hope that he would be found. And I don't know the end of that story, but I suspect that he was never found alive. I remember going to speak at a graveside funeral once. It was way out in the country. I left early to make sure I would be there on time, and I got there early rather than late, and it gave me time to walk around the cemetery. And I noticed one family that there were 5 different people who had died within 3 days of each other in 1919, when the flu epidemic had swept through the entire world, a pandemic. And I think back to those stories and just think of the tragedy and the potential for bitterness that can come in those moments of tragedy. And I can sympathize with Naomi saying, "Don't call me Naomi, pleasant, joyful. Call me bitter, because the Lord has dealt bitterly with me." And yes, there's irony in that use of the word Bethlehem, house of bread. I remember when I was like those of you who are students going to seminary in Dallas at Southern Methodist University, and I would travel by the Mrs. Baird's bakery. And early in the morning, you could just, that sweet smell of bread baking. And yet, when tragedy causes the taste of tears in our mouth to even turn sweet-smelling bread bitter, is where Naomi was when she returns to Bethlehem. And I can see those women looking at her in the stir with this lady who's coming to Bethlehem with a Moabite woman. And it says there was a great stir. And they asked the question, "Is this Naomi?" And it was probably really an exclamation. I'd been where Naomi was. A few weeks ago, I was asked to make a pastoral visit to a family that the daughters were waiting for me, and I had not seen most of them for 30 years. One was waiting out front and said, "Are you Stan?" I said, "Yes." And she said, "I was told to be looking for someone with red hair." She could have said worse, but I know how Naomi was feeling at that moment. So tragedies can take away the sweetness of the smell of bread. But even though Naomi thought God was working against her, as we read the entirety of Ruth, we find that actually God was working in the background for her. His loving kindness was going to be shown through Ruth and through a man named Boaz that we'll read about in the weeks to come. From this migrant lady following her home, Naomi receives the loving kindness of God. And that should open our eyes that God can be at work even when we think He might be against us. That God can be at work, but like Naomi and like Ruth, we have to take action. We can't just sit back passively. But God calls us into that story with them to where His loving kindness is lived out. And yes, God works where we don't see it. And I think we could take several things from this reading. It might give us some perspective on those that we call illegal aliens and migrants. It's very easy to use that harsher term of illegal alien. But how does God's loving kindness see them? And how will we see them with God's loving kindness? Another perspective from this reading was for me yesterday morning, gathering around the Lord's table with other Christians. This homily was in the back of my mind, and I thought, here we are in Bethlehem, in the house of bread, on a table where bread was laid out, but also a cup. And yes, there was anger, anguish, and bitterness on that day that Jesus told His disciples, "I'm going to lay down my life for you." But that sweet-smelling bread, even through the tears that bring bitterness, can work among us even today. At the table, it is where God is not passive but is active, and ask us to be active with Him in this house known as Bethlehem. It is where God redeems tragedy and anguish through another one born in Bethlehem. And it is where death is defeated and we are filled with the bread of life, and it gives us hope. So there are those times in life that all of us face moments of tragedy. And the sweet smell of bread can actually taste bitter. We may even think that God is against us. But in the background, in the reading of the story of Ruth, we find a God who is at work in His loving kindness, and ask us to be with Him in that loving kindness, to be the very channels of that love to those who need Him.